Gravel bit into Nora's frozen cheekbone. She swallowed dry saliva, tasting raw copper, desperately ignoring an achingly full bladder. 30 hostile men swarmed a ruined facility below. Her radio hissed with 2 hours of dead static. Command placed her here strictly as bait. Nobody actually expected her to survive. The cold was no longer an external force. It had moved inside her. It sat deep in the marrow of her bones, radiating a dull, throbbing ache through her joints. Nora shifted her weight against the frozen shale of the ridgeline, instantly regretting it. The movement sent a sharp spasm up her left calf. She gritted her teeth, burying her face into the damp collar of her fleece to stifle the grunt. 4 hours in the prone position. Her toes felt like wooden blocks. Her bladder was a tight, pulsing knot in her lower abdomen. A desperate discomfort she had to constantly file away in the back of her mind. She pressed her eye back to the rubber cup of the optic. The glass was freezing, biting into the fragile skin around her orbital bone. Through the magnified lens, the abandoned Soviet-era mining facility looked like a rusted scar against the snowless grey valley. Faint wisps of black smoke curled from corrugated tin roofs, carrying the faint, sour stench of burning diesel and raw trash up the mountainside. "Harding, you take the high ground." Garrick's voice played back in her head, clipped and patronizing. "If they push north, make some noise. Ping the towers. Keep them looking up while we slip the back door." "Make some noise." Nora breathed out slowly, watching her breath plume in the thin mountain air. It was a polite way of saying, "Be the decoy." Garrick would never admit it aloud, but he didn't want her in the stack. He didn't trust her in the claustrophobic, violent geometry of a close-quarters breach. The trident pinned to her uniform didn't matter. The grueling pipeline didn't matter. When the chips were down, Garrick put the female SEAL on a rock 1,000 yards away to shoot at empty guard towers and draw fire. She was the shiny object, the sacrificial lamb if things went south. She hadn't argued. Arguing meant she was emotional. She just nodded, picked up the 30-pound Macmillan TAC 50 and climbed the mountain. Down in the valley, the shadows lengthened. Nora blinked, her eyelid heavy and gritty with dust. A yellow bulb flickered to life above the facility's main motor pool. She tracked her crosshairs across the courtyard. 2 guards smoking, a stray dog sniffing at a rusted-out BMP armoured transport. The rhythmic mechanical scan of a professional. Then the world tore open. It didn't start with a heroic explosion. It started with a wet, heavy thud, followed instantly by the staccato, ripping canvas sound of a PKM machine gun. Nora flinched, her heart slamming against her ribs. She ripped her eye from the scope, scanning the southern perimeter. Tracers, ugly, bright green lines, were pouring out of a fortified concrete bunker, converging on a shallow ditch just outside the facility's wire. Her team wasn't slipping through the back door. They were pinned. "Bravo 1, this is Overwatch. Talk to me," Nora barked into her throat mic. Static hissed back, a thick, impenetrable wall of white noise, jamming. The hostiles hadn't just gotten lucky, they had expected company. They had let Garrick and the team walk right into the kill zone before flipping the switch. Nora went back to the glass, her breath coming faster now, fogging the edge of the optic. Panic, raw and acidic, crept up her throat. She fought it down, forcing her hands to stop trembling. She cranked the magnification. In the ditch, she could see the muddy, tactical shapes of her team. One was unmoving, slumped face down in the dirt. Reed. It had to be Reed. He was point. 2 others were dragging him behind the rotting husk of a transport truck, while the earth around them chewed itself into pieces under the relentless machine gun fire. They were trapped. The ditch offered cover from the front, but Nora could see the enemy flanking. A dozen men with AK-47s were moving through the rusted shipping containers to the east, executing an L-shaped ambush. In 3 minutes, Bravo team would be flanked. In 4 minutes, they would be dead. The protocol was strict. If the team was compromised and comms were down, Overwatch was to break contact, exfiltrate to the secondary rally point, and wait for quick reaction force. She was supposed to survive. She was supposed to walk away. Nora stared at the men moving through the containers. She thought about Garrick. She thought about his condescending tone. She thought about the rigid military doctrine that told her to pack up her rifle and leave them to die. A sharp, hysterical laugh caught in her throat. She swallowed it, the sound tasting like bile. Be the decoy, she thought. All right, Garrick, Nora whispered to the wind, her voice trembling slightly. Let's make some noise. Her finger settled on the trigger. It felt numb, the tactile sensation of the curved metal entirely lost to the cold, but muscle memory took over. She adjusted her parallax, dialed in her elevation for 800 yards, and settled the crosshairs on the chest of the PKM gunner in the concrete bunker. She didn't feel heroic. She felt sick. Her stomach churned with the jalapeno cheese spread she'd eaten 6 hours ago. She was terrified of missing. She was terrified of hitting. She exhaled. She held it. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil wasn't a push. It was a localized earthquake. The heavy rifle roared, sending a concussive shockwave that rattled Nora's teeth and punched her collarbone with the force of a swinging bat. Through the optic, the result was immediate and grotesque. The .50 caliber armor-piercing round didn't gently drop the gunner. It hit the cinder block wall just beneath the gun port, shattering the concrete before tearing through the man's torso. He didn't fly backward like in the movies. He simply folded, collapsing over the heavy weapon like a discarded pile of rags. A high-pitched tinnitus whine instantly replaced the ambient wind in Nora's left ear. She didn't pause to admire the shot. The bolt action felt gritty, sticking for a fraction of a second before she wrenched it back. Hot brass cartwheeled through the cold air, landing against her cheek. It burned, but she ignored it, driving the bolt forward, stripping a fresh round into the chamber. Down in the valley, the enemy perimeter froze. For 3 seconds, there was total bewildered silence. Then the anthill was kicked over. Shouts echoed up the canyon walls. Flashlights darted through the gloom. The flanking element, the men creeping through the shipping containers, stopped their advance and looked up toward the ridge. Nora already had the lead man in her sights. Crack, another brutal slam to her shoulder. The lead flanker went down hard, his rifle clattering against a rusted tin wall. They knew where she was now. Tracers began to float up the mountainside, slow at first, then accelerating as they ripped past her position. The snapping sound of bullets breaking the sound barrier above her head sounded like heavy canvas tearing. Dust and shale exploded around her, raining grit into her hair and down her neck. Then came the hollow thump of a mortar tube. Nora's blood ran cold, shoot and scoot. The doctrine screamed in her head. She had exactly 20 seconds before a high-explosive shell turned her rock shelf into a crater. She didn't meticulously pack her gear. She grabbed the TAC-50 by the carrying handle, abandoned her spotting scope, and scrambled backward. She moved like an exhausted animal, crab-walking over the jagged rocks, her chest heaving, the burning in her thighs flaring into agonizing cramps. She threw herself over the lip of the ridge just as the first mortar shell hit. The explosion was a deafening crack that sucked the air from her lungs. The shockwave lifted her slightly off the ground, throwing a wave of pulverized rock over her back. She coughed, the taste of cordite and dust flooding her mouth. There was no time to rest. The only way off the mountain was down, directly into the jaws of the facility. Nora plunged down the scree slope. It wasn't a tactical, controlled descent. It was a controlled fall. The rocks shifted under her boots. She slipped, twisting her ankle violently. A sharp, bright stab of pain shot up her leg, so intense it made her vision white out for a second. She tumbled, sliding on her hip across the sharp slate, tearing the reinforced fabric of her uniform and scraping her thigh raw. She slammed into a stunted pine tree, halting her slide. She lay there for a second, gasping, staring at the night sky. Tears of pure frustration and pain pricked the corners of her eyes. She noticed a torn fingernail on her left hand, bleeding freely. Of all the things to focus on, the stinging pain of the nail infuriated her the most. It felt so stupid, so pathetic in the middle of a gunfight. "Get up," she hissed to herself, her voice cracking. "Get the fuck up." Using the tree, she pulled herself upright. She couldn't lug the 30-pound sniper rifle through close quarters. It was useless here. With trembling hands, she unlatched the heavy weapon and shoved it under the brush. She drew her sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226, thumbing the safety off. It felt pitifully small in her hands. She limped the remaining 50 yards to the perimeter fence. The smell of the base hit her fully now, a sickening mixture of human waste, rotting garbage, and wet rust. She pulled a pair of wire cutters from her vest. Her hands were cramping so badly she could barely squeeze the grips. Snip, snip. The dull metallic clicks felt louder than the mortar fire in her panicked mind. She pushed through the gap, snagging her fleece on a barb, tearing it. She was inside. Nora pressed her back against a freezing, corrugated metal wall of a storage shed. She was shaking violently, though whether from the freezing air or the adrenaline dumping into her system, she couldn't tell. She forced herself to breathe. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The tactical breathing didn't stop the fear, but it pushed it down just far enough for her to function. Footsteps, heavy boots splashing in mud, moving fast around the corner of the shed. Nora didn't think. She raised the pistol. A hostile combatant rounded the corner. He was young, maybe 20, eyes wide, struggling to sling an AK-47 over his shoulder. He saw her. For a microsecond, they just stared at each other. Two terrified humans in the dark. Nora fired twice. It wasn't clean. Her hands were shaking too much. The first shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him. The second hit him low in the gut. The boy screamed, a horrific, high-pitched wail that tore through the air. He dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, clutching his stomach, thrashing in the mud. Nora froze. The sound of his screaming paralyzed her. It wasn't like shooting a silhouette from 1,000 yards through a scope. It was visceral, loud, and wet. The smell of voided bowels hit her instantly. "Finish it," a dark, clinical part of her brain ordered. She stepped forward, her boots heavy. She aimed at his head. Her finger hovered over the trigger. She was crying now, silent tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. She hated him for making her do this. She hated Garrick for putting her here. She pulled the trigger. Click, stovepipe jam. The casing hadn't ejected properly, caught in the slide of her pistol. Panic seized her. The boy on the ground was reaching for a combat knife on his belt, his face twisted in agony and rage. Nora slapped the side of the pistol, racking the slide violently. The spent casing cleared, spinning away into the dark. She didn't aim down the sights. She just pointed and fired. The report was deafening in the tight space between the buildings. The boy slumped backward into the mud, his screaming cut abruptly short. Nora stood over him, her chest heaving, the pistol still raised, shaking in her grip. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant crackle of the firefight on the other side of the compound. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in mud and a few speckles of the boy's blood. She wasn't a PR talking point. She wasn't a decoy anymore. She wiped her nose on her sleeve, leaving a smear of dirt across her cheek. She checked her magazine, took a shaky breath, and stepped over the body, moving deeper into the shadows of the base. The deeper Nora pushed into the camp, the more the world narrowed to a tunnel of raw, agonizing sensation. The adrenaline from the encounter in the alley was receding, leaving behind a cold, hollow tremor in her hands and a blinding throb in her right ankle. Every time she put weight on it, a spike of nausea hit the back of her throat. She clung to the shadows of the rusted shipping containers, dragging her bad leg slightly, her boots sinking into the semi-frozen mud. The stench here was industrial and sharp. Spilled diesel, burning plastic, and the acrid metallic tang of hot brass drifting over from the firefight. To her left, the main hostile force was still hammering the ditch. The steady, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the DSHK heavy machine gun vibrated in her chest cavity. They were systematically dismantling the rusted transport truck Bravo team was using for cover. It was only a matter of time before the steel gave way entirely. Nora wiped a mixture of sweat and freezing drizzle from her forehead. Her tactical gloves were slick with mud and the dead boy's blood. She needed to break the jamming signal. Without comms, they were ghosts, entirely cut off from the quick reaction force idling at the forward operating base 50 miles away. She tracked a cluster of thick, black power cables snaking through the muck. They were hastily laid, half buried in the tire ruts of a dirt road, leading toward a squat, cinder-block building at the center of the compound. The roof bristled with crude, spiderweb-like VHF antennas. Bingo. She crossed the open gap between a stack of rotting wooden pallets and the building, her breath catching as the floodlights swept over the yard. She pressed herself flat against the rough, cold concrete of the comms building, the abrasive surface scratching the skin of her cheek. The low, vibrating hum of a heavy-duty diesel generator masked the sound of her approach. It also meant she wouldn't hear anyone coming up behind her. She edged toward the reinforced steel door. It was propped open a few inches with a cinder block to vent the exhaust. The smell pouring out was suffocating, a toxic wave of carbon monoxide, ozone, and cheap, unwashed wool. Nora peered through the crack. The room was cramped, lit by the harsh, blue-white glare of a fluorescent tube. Racks of Soviet-era radio equipment were jury-rigged next to a modern, commercial-grade signal jammer that blinked with angry red LEDs. A single technician sat in a folding chair, his back to her. He was a broad-shouldered man in a surplus olive-drab sweater, wearing heavy headphones, entirely absorbed in adjusting a dial on the primary transceiver. An AK-74 leaned against the desk, inches from his hand. Nora couldn't use her pistol. A gunshot inside the concrete box would echo across the courtyard, drawing half the camp. It had to be quiet. It had to be fast. She sheathed her Sig Sauer and drew her fixed-blade combat knife. The handle felt foreign and slippery in her wet glove. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She had never killed someone with a blade before. The simulations in Coronado always involved clean, decisive strikes on rubber dummies. They never accounted for the smell of the room or the frantic, desperate resistance of a living, breathing human being. She took a slow, jagged breath, tasting the exhaust fumes. She kicked the cinder block aside. The door creaked as she slipped inside. The technician didn't hear her over the generator and his headphones. Nora closed the distance in 3 agonizingly slow steps. Her bad ankle buckled slightly on the slick, grease-stained floor. Her boot scuffed. The man stiffened. He began to turn. Nora didn't hesitate. She lunged, throwing her entire body weight forward, tackling him out of the chair. It was instantly, disastrously messy. They crashed to the concrete floor in a tangle of limbs. The technician was incredibly strong, smelling of stale sweat and garlic. He grunted, a guttural sound of shock, and threw a wild elbow backward. It caught Nora in the jaw, snapping her head back. Stars exploded in her peripheral vision. Her teeth clamped down hard on her own tongue, filling her mouth with the hot, coppery taste of blood. He bucked, trying to roll her off, his hands scrabbling for the rifle leaning against the desk. Nora dropped the knife. It clattered uselessly under the radio rack. She panicked, resorting to pure animal instinct. She grabbed a fistful of his thick hair and slammed his head into the metal corner of the generator casing. Clang! He roared in pain, twisting violently. His heavy boot caught her in the stomach, knocking the wind out of her in a sharp, agonizing rush. Nora gasped, her vision dimming. He was scrambling to his knees now, his hand closing around the pistol grip of the AK. He's going to kill me, she thought. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was cold and deeply pathetic. I'm going to die on a greasy floor in a room that smells like exhaust. She saw a heavy, rusted crescent wrench lying on the edge of the desk. With a desperate, choking sob, she threw herself forward, ignoring the burning in her lungs. She grabbed the wrench with both hands and swung it downward with everything she had left. The heavy iron connected with the side of the technician's head with a sickening, wet crunch. It didn't sound like a movie. It sounded like a melon being dropped on pavement. The man instantly went limp, collapsing heavily onto the floor, his fingers slipping from the rifle. His left leg twitched once, then stilled. A dark pool of blood began to expand across the grey concrete, mixing with the spilled motor oil. Nora dropped the wrench. It landed with a dull thud. She fell back against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. She sat there, her chest heaving, coughing violently as the exhaust fumes burned her throat. She looked at her hands. They were shaking so violently she couldn't make a fist. She spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor, the pain in her tongue sharp and stinging. "God," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was a pathetic, broken sound. She couldn't sit there. Bravo was dying. She forced herself to her feet, leaning heavily on the desk. She grabbed the heavy black power cables feeding the jammer and yanked. They didn't budge. Swearing weakly, she picked up her dropped knife, ignoring the blood on the handle, and sawed frantically at the thick rubber casing of the main wire. Sparks showered her hands, singing the fabric of her gloves, but she kept cutting until the wire severed with a sharp crack and a puff of acrid smoke. The red LEDs on the jammer flickered and died. Nora reached up to her throat mic, her fingers fumbling over the transmit button. "Any station on this net, this is Overwatch," she rasped, her voice trembling. "Jamming is down. I need a massive, immediate QRF. Grid is locked. Troops in contact. We are combat ineffective." Static hissed in her earpiece for 2 agonizing seconds. Then a clear, crisp voice cut through the dark. "Overwatch, this is Viper Actual. We have your beacon. Apaches are 10 minutes out. Hang tight." Nora closed her eyes, leaning her head against the cold metal rack. 10 minutes. It felt like 10 lifetimes. "Bravo 1, this is Overwatch," Nora said, switching frequencies. "Comms are up. Air is 10 mics out." "Harding," Garrick's voice came back. It didn't sound arrogant or clipped anymore. It sounded small, It sounded terrified. "Jesus Christ, where are you?" "Inside the wire. Comms building." "They're flanking us, Harding. Reed is hit bad. Arterial. We're out of 40mm. We're running dry." Nora looked at the dead technician on the floor. She looked at his AK-74 and the canvas chest rig strapped to his body, bulging with spare magazines. She wasn't a decoy anymore. "I'm coming," Nora said. She stripped the chest rig from the dead man. It was covered in his blood, sticky and warm against her hands, but she buckled it over her own gear anyway. She picked up the AK, checked the chamber, and limped out the door into the freezing drizzle. The base had realized the jammer was down. The floodlights were frantically panning across the compound, and she could hear shouts echoing from the motor pool. The focus was shifting from the ditch back to the interior. They were hunting her. Nora moved fast, entirely abandoning stealth. The pain in her ankle was a white-hot siren, but she compartmentalized it, pushing it into a dark box in her mind. She sprinted, a grotesque, lopsided hobble, between the rusted BMPs and the supply tents. Two hostiles rounded a corner 50 yards ahead, running toward the comms building. Nora didn't aim through the sights. She raised the heavy Russian rifle, tucked the wooden stock hard into her bruised shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon bucked wildly, a completely different recoil impulse than her familiar M4. A spray of 5.45mm rounds chewed up the dirt and sparked against the corrugated tin wall next to the men. They screamed, diving for cover into a muddy drainage trench. It wasn't accurate, but it bought her the seconds she needed. She reached the southern perimeter fence, the wire separating the base from the ditch where Bravo was trapped. The DSHK machine gun was still firing, its muzzle flashes illuminating the mud in strobes of hellish yellow light. The gunner was in a reinforced sandbag pit to her right, entirely focused on the ditch. He didn't see her behind him. Nora braced herself against a concrete pylon. She aimed down the crude iron sights, placing the front post squarely on the back of the gunner's head. She pulled the trigger. The gunner slumped forward over the heavy weapon. The deafening thump, thump, thump abruptly ceased, leaving a ringing silence in its wake, filled only by the crackle of smaller arms fire. Nora scrambled over the lip of the embankment and slid down the muddy incline, tumbling the last 10 feet into the ditch. She landed hard on her side, splashing in a foot of freezing, filthy water. She gasped, trying to sit up. "Hold your fire! Hold fire!" a voice screamed. Hands grabbed her vest, dragging her behind the shredded chassis of the transport truck. Nora blinked the mud from her eyes. Garrick was looking down at her. His face was unrecognizable, caked in black dirt, soot, and smeared blood. His eyes were wide, white, and frantic. Beside him, Miller was pressing both hands frantically into Reed's thigh. Reed wasn't screaming. He was terrifyingly silent, his skin the color of wet ash. The smell of copper and voided bowels in the confined space of the ditch was suffocating. "You're here," Garrick said, staring at her chest rig, the foreign AK in her hands, the blood smeared across her jaw. He looked completely shattered. The rigid hierarchy, the condescension, the decoy protocol, it had all burned away in the span of 30 minutes. Nora didn't offer a reassuring smile. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt exhausted to her bones. She tasted dirt and her own blood. 10 minutes, she rasped, coughing. "Apaches are coming." They didn't speak after that. There were no heroic last stands, no swelling orchestral music. They simply huddled in the freezing mud, shivering violently, returning fire blindly over the lip of the ditch with the AK-74 whenever the enemy tried to push the wire. Nora fired until the wood of the handguard burned her palm through her wet glove, until her ears were ringing so loudly she felt dizzy. Then, the sky tore open. It wasn't the heroic fanfare of a rescue. It was the terrifying mechanical roar of Hellfire missiles and 30mm chain guns ripping the earth apart. The Apaches came in low, their rotors vibrating the water in the ditch. The sheer concussive force of the gunships unleashing their payload on the base was physically painful, a deafening wave of violence that flattened the hostiles. 20 minutes later, the exfil Black Hawk touched down in a storm of dust and rotor wash. The flight back to the FOB was entirely silent. The interior of the helicopter smelled of JP-8 jet fuel and wet earth. The red jump lights cast long, grim shadows over the team. Miller sat staring blankly at the floor. Garrick had his head in his hands. A medic was working frantically over Reed on a litter in the center of the cabin, the floor slick with pink-tinged water. Nora sat by the open door, the cold wind whipping her face. The adrenaline was entirely gone now, leaving behind a profound, hollow ache. Her jaw throbbed where she had been hit. Her tongue was swollen. Her ankle felt like it was encased in broken glass. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. Her tactical gloves were ruined, torn and stained dark brown. Through a tear in the index finger, she could see her torn fingernail. The bleeding had stopped, leaving a crusty black edge. Garrick looked up from his hands. He looked across the cabin at her. His mouth opened, as if he wanted to say something, to thank her, to apologize, to acknowledge what she had done. Nora didn't want to hear it. She just looked away, turning her head to stare out at the vast, dark emptiness of the mountains rolling by beneath them. She pulled the torn fleece tighter around her neck, shivering as the cold settled back into her bones. If this raw, unfiltered look at the reality of combat resonated with you, drop a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you want more grounded, gritty military stories that skip the Hollywood cliches and focus on the human cost? Share this video with someone who appreciates intense storytelling, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next upload.